Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time this evening for our rescheduled installment of Tell Me More Talks with Conservation Minnesota. This is our reoccurring webinar series where we chat with experts on important environmental issues. I'm Liz Deering, the Deputy Director of Conservation Minnesota. I'll be moderating our panel discussion this evening on sustainable aviation fuels, often referred to as SAF. But before we get going, I do want to take a moment to remember Speaker Emeritus Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark. We continue to be stunned and heartbroken by their assassination. Melissa was a friend of the organization and a true champion for the environment. Conservation Minnesota will continue to carry on her legacy and the work that she's done for the people of Minnesota and the great outdoors. For those of you who might be less familiar with Conservation Minnesota, we are a nonprofit organization whose mission is to protect the Minnesota you love by solving our state's most important conservation problems. Tonight, we will discuss the future of sustainable aviation fuel, how it can help reduce carbon emissions, improve water quality, and how Minnesota is already leading the way. We have the fortunate we are fortunate tonight to have three sustainable aviation fuel leaders with us. Just a reminder as well that if you have questions, you can go ahead and pop those into the chat at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And if we have time, we will try to get those answered this evening. So tonight's panelists include Dr. Nick Jordan, who co-directs the Forever Green Initiative, which is a cross-sector collaborative network working to advance crops that provide continuous living cover for Midwest agriculture. Next, we have Trevor Russell from the Friends of the Mississippi River. Trevor has served as their water program director for nearly 2 decades and works on federal and state water quality advocacy, education, communications, and coalition development. And last but certainly not least, we have Julia Silvis, Managing Director of Research and Intelligence at Greater MSP. In this role, she supports the business investment team, Greater MSP's strategic initiatives, and shapes regional strategy. Thank you so much to all of you for being here. We like to start our Tell Me More webinars by asking our panelists to share their favorite outdoor place in Minnesota. So I'll kick off with mine. As somebody who grew up along the Mississippi River in different places, it might be kind of cliche, but to say that the headwaters of the Mississippi and Itasca State Park are pretty special. It's great to see where that mighty Mississippi starts. It's just a little trickling stream you can walk through. So Julia, could you share your favorite place?
The place that is most accessible to me, that's like the mix between most accessible and wildest, is probably Theoworth Park and the kind of Brownie Lake, North Cedar Lake part of the world, which when the lakes are frozen, I can ski to from my house. So I love that spot.
Wonderful. Trevor, can you share yours?
Yes, Liz, you had the correct answer. The headwaters of the Mississippi River is by far the best and most important outdoor natural resource in Minnesota.
All right. And Nick, could you share yours?
Thank you, Liz. Well, obviously, this is a pretty difficult question, but I am going to identify a place called Swede Hollow here in St. Paul, which is a fascinating urban landscape that has a really interesting human history, as a place where lots and lots of folks made their homes when they first came to Minnesota from other parts of the world. And also is kind of a fascinating piece of terrain, being a steep gorge right in the heart of St. Paul with a lot of interesting plant life. Plus, I'm always interested by seeing the more than human living world and the human world sort of jumbled together in interesting ways. And Sweet Hollow has that going for it as well.
It does. All right. Well, thank you for sharing, everyone. So to kick us off, Nick, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about what the Forever Green Initiative is and what are some of the most promising crops that you're working on.
Yeah, I would love to do that. So, Forever Green is founded on the premise that we have a truly great world-class agriculture here in the Midwest. And we have truly great world-class soils here in the Midwest. And we have some of the best soils that are available to humankind in the entire world. And for those reasons, it makes a lot of sense to work hard to take care of those soils. And the most important thing that you can do to take care of a soil is to have a living plant in it for as much of the time as you can possibly do, because soil is very much a living thing, and soil is very much co-created by plants and microorganisms in the soil. So the reality is that our current agriculture in the Midwest is mainly based on plants that grow for just some part of the year, whether it's the summer with our crops like corn and soybean, or it's over the fall and the spring in the case of a crop like winter wheat. And so what we are trying to do in Forever Green is come up with an additional set of crops that make sense for our Minnesota and upper Midwest agriculture, that also help us move in this crucial direction of having the soil covered by a living plant or occupied by a living plant for as much of the time as we can manage. And so some of these crops are perennial crops that literally solve that problem by being alive all year round. But others are crops that play well with our current crops. For example, crops that grow in the fall and the spring when our main and survive the winter, when our main summer crops are not growing rather. So the idea is to have some kind of, as I said, living plant occupying the soil and keeping that soil protected and continuing to build that soil by the biological processes that are necessary to keep soil happy and healthy. And of course, farming is a business. So the only way that these crops are going to be of any value to our agriculture is if the world wants and needs them. So we have worked very hard in Forever Green to identify a set of crops that can help us have that living root in the soil um, business, and that also produce things that the world wants and needs. So, as an example, the world is very interested in low carbon vegetable oils. In other words, vegetable oils that are produced with relatively low carbon footprints compared to alternative sources of, in some cases, same products, say from petroleum sources. And the world is also interested in things like animal feeds that also have relatively low um, effects on the carbon. And one of the ways, and well, a number of our crops are very interesting from both those points of view. So we have this portfolio of crops that take good care of soil and produce things that the world wants and needs. And Forever Green is about doing three things. One is using all of the tools of modern agricultural science to develop these crops as quickly as possible. And it's now possible to do that amazingly quickly using tools like genomics that let us improve crops genetically much quicker than before. So that's the first thing we do, is that we just use the tools of science to improve these crops comprehensively, starting with trying to improve their genes by crop breeding and genomics, but also trying to figure out at the other end of the value chain, if you will, how to make products that the world wants and needs and that can readily be used by our industries that make things out of agricultural commodities. So Forever Green also does two other things. One is that we work very hard and with lots of partners in the both the public and the private sectors to actively commercialize these crops. It has been the case in the past that universities like the University of Minnesota were always trying to come up with new crops. But in the past, generally speaking, all we really did was offer a new crop that might grow well in Minnesota and might make farmers some money, offer that up, sort of at the level of here's some seeds. Want to give it a try? And, unsurprisingly, that sort of very passive way of trying to commercialize new crops didn't generally get very far. So we, in very strong contrast to that, work really hard to try to commercialize these crops with lots of partners, as I mentioned. We also understand that supportive policy and finance and other factors are really critical to getting new crops off the ground. And therefore, we work with a lot of partners whose specialty is in advocacy and policy innovation. And we think that all three legs of that table, the research on the crops, the proactive commercialization, and the working hard to achieve supportive policy, are critical to what we do in Forever Green. And I should finally say that Forever Green is a network, as you mentioned in your intro, that spans a lot of different sectors. And the University of Minnesota is integrally involved. But it is by no means anything that's owned and operated by the University of Minnesota. It is a cross-sector partnership.
Great. Thank you for that description. So Trevor, your organization, Friends of the Mississippi River, has been advocating for funding through the state legislature for forever green initiatives. Why is that so important to the mission of your organization and the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Our mission is to protect and restore the Mississippi River and its watershed in Minnesota. And, specifically within our water program, we're focused on getting the Mississippi River to achieve our state and federal water quality goals. And that means reducing pollution. And while wastewater, urban runoff, industrial sources are important, and the work to reduce those pollutant sources is ongoing and needs long-term support, agriculture is by far the largest source of pollution to the Mississippi River and to Minnesota's waters in general. And as Nick mentioned, year after year, we've got millions of acres of cropland left barren and exposed to the elements from late fall into early spring, 7 or 8 months a year, each and every year. And that sort of big brown spot on satellite imagery is really the driving source of pollutants to the Mississippi River. So if we want to get to clean water, we know as an organization, we need to find a way to green up that big brown spot. And that means getting these forever green cropping systems, or what we call continuous living cover, or CLC cropping systems, on the ground in Minnesota at the millions of acres scale. That is the key to achieving our clean water, habitat, and soil health goals. But if we do that through the tools that we've traditionally focused on, we don't think we'll be successful. We can't make farmers grow it through a regulatory mechanism. And we know that voluntary cost share programs and land retirement are not reasonably or realistically scalable. And so we have become strong partners with University of Minnesota, specifically because market-based continuous living cover cropping systems that provide an economic return for farmers while getting us, the clean water outcomes that we're looking for, is the most important investment we can make in getting to clean water and farm prosperity in Minnesota. And so over the years, we have moved into a closer and closer relationship with the University of Minnesota and folks like Dr. Jordan, because we think the cropping systems that they're developing are the key to bringing clean water back to Minnesota.
Great. So to step back a little bit too and transition to sort of what is sustainable aviation fuel. Julia, if you could kind of talk about what is SAF and how is it going to lower our carbon emissions and what does that look like?
Yeah, thank you. So, so SAF can be referred to as sustainable aviation fuel. In some areas, it's called synthetic aviation fuel. All aviation fuel is somewhat synthetic because it doesn't like grow on trees. But SAF is an aviation fuel that, as defined by the federal government, has life cycle emissions that are 50% less than fuel that's made from conventional fossil sources. So it has to meet that threshold of, of carbon reduction to qualify for federal tax incentives, and many states who have tax incentives are using that as a definition as well. So that's kind of it's not necessarily a scientific definition, but it's one that's widely accepted as kind of what SAF is. There's a lot of different ways to lower carbon emissions when you're making fuel. So one way is to make it from crops or crops or residues or some kind of organic material that is grown in a less carbon intensive way. There are ways to use waste material to make SAF, and there are ways to make SAF from even carbon dioxide that you would pull out of the air and green hydrogen and things. So there's this kind of theoretical ability to make SAF that would be net carbon negative or net neutral. That's a bit technically difficult and maybe a bit of a ways off. And at the moment, when you look at kind of what's technically possible, organic matter is more feasible for us to make SAF out of. And within the hub, one thing we're trying to do is, meet this demand for sustainable aviation fuel in Minnesota. There's, aviation fuel is probably 2 to 3% of global carbon emissions, and it's a hard to abate sector. There's again not like science in that, but it's difficult to get. Maybe there is science, and it's difficult to get the right amount of energy density into the relatively small fuselage of an airplane that you need to fly it. So there are, of course, you know, potential ways to make aircraft more efficient and routes more efficient, and electrify ground things, ground equipment. So there's lots of ways to sort of reduce overall aviation emissions, but the bulk of it is in that jet fuel. And within the hub, we really look at a lot of different pathways, a lot of different feedstocks. We're not trying to pick a feedstock, and we are trying to make sure that we are prioritizing feedstocks that are, as much as possible, that are going to have that really deep carbon reductions and ideally have ancillary benefits. And, we explicitly say we don't want to try to decarbonize aviation and accidentally cause some sort of other environmental harm, which we know we've seen that in certain areas. So that's something that we're really trying to be mindful of. SAF is a very nascent industry, and so what we do now is very important in sort of setting the course of this new chapter. So that was maybe a little longer of a definition, but it's a bit of definition and context. Yeah.
That's useful. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
So maybe going back to you, Dr. Jordan, to speak a little bit, what are some of the promising crops that really could have those lower um, carbon footprint um, than some of the other ones that might be out there? But what are some of the exciting things and the promising crops that Forever Green is working on?
Yeah, well, thanks, Liz. And let me speak specifically to crops that are promising from a sustainable or synthetic aviation fuel point of view. And there are two that particularly stand out among the crops that the Forever Green Project is developing. One of these is called winter camelina. The other is called pennycress. And these are both members of the mustard family. And they both count as oil seeds in terms of what kind of crops they are. So an oil seed is something that produces protein and oil. So soybean is a good example of an oil seed. And it's different from a grain crop where you're especially interested in carbohydrate. So we have these two oil seeds. They are both very interesting plants in the sense that they are super hardy. So the deal with both of them is that they get planted in the fall and they grow for a while and provide the benefits of covering soil and feeding all the living things in soil until it gets cold and things freeze up. And they're not completely immune from being killed by winter in Minnesota, but they're pretty darn tough and hardy. And so they then pick up the thread of growing when things start to warm up, which can be as early as March. They can resume growth, and generally by April, what we'll see in the fields that have these crops is a strongly growing canopy of green across fields that otherwise would be brown and would unfortunately be part of the brown spot that Trevor mentioned, and would unfortunately not be protected from the damaging things that happen to soils when they're not protected by a living plant. So they get revved up to grow in the spring, and they grow. They're both kind of knee high when they are ready to be harvested. They flower abundantly in the latter part of the spring, and provide masses of flowers at a time when many of our out in farm country, we might not have too much else that's flowering. So they provide a big environmental benefit for pollinators and other beneficial insects that are dependent on those kinds of flowers. So they flower, they produce their seeds, they get harvested, and they get out of the way. And it is then possible to plant a summer crop. And especially, it works very well to plant soybean along with these crops. And there's a little bit of technical detail around how you do that. But that's the basic idea, is that we grow these crops after things that have grown during the warm season of the previous year in the fall. They grow fall and spring, they get harvested, they get out of the way. And so in that way, it's actually possible to grow 3 crops in 2 growing seasons rather than 2 crops in 2 growing seasons. And so both of these crops are very much in development. We are working very hard to improve them genetically and to refine how you grow them so that they play well with other crops, and to do the other research and development type stuff that we need to make them feasible options for being part of the picture of how we're providing SAF to the aviation industry. And I could certainly elaborate on the value that these crops offer to farmers and so on, but maybe I've said enough for the moment, just watching the clock.
Um, thank you. Um, so and along those lines, Trevor, you kind of touched on this already, and I don't know if there's anything else to add. Maybe you've sort of hit the main points, but obviously if we were able to adopt widespread coverage with these sustainable fuel crops, what are really the water quality benefits that we would see? I mean, like you talked about not having the brown spot in the land. Obviously, that creates a lot of runoff. But are there other things that are really important to that water quality benefit?
Uh, yeah, Liz, funny you should ask. So in late 2023, FMR and the University of Minnesota Forever Green Initiative published a report called Putting Down Roots, and that offered sort of a clear-eyed assessment of how forever green cropping systems could scale up over time. And then essentially what we found is that even at a moderate adoption level, we could expect 8 to 10 million acres of these forever green cropping systems on the landscape by 2050. And a little over half of that, 5.5 million acres of these, would be winter annual oil seeds that Nick mentioned, pennycress and camelina, that have a specific application in the sustainable aviation fuel space. What would that kind of acreage, that 8 to 10 million acres, mean? We think it would produce roughly a 23% reduction in nitrogen loss to the Mississippi River, about a 35% reduction in sediment or erosion to our waters, while also blunting on-farm greenhouse gas emissions and increasing net on-farm profits by approximately 20%. And so as markets mature, plant genetics improve, technical assistance and equipment access for farmers is more readily available, and the supply chains necessary to get these crops from the farm gate to the store shelf or the plain wing mature, we do see a scenario where these crops really scale up to solve more than half of Minnesota's water quality challenges all by themselves. And I will put a link to that report in our chat.
Thank you for that, Trevor. There was a lot of stats in there, so a report to follow back up with will be great for our listeners tonight. So Julia, kind of expanding on that, what kind of economic benefits would sustainable aviation fuel produce for Minnesota? And how do we kind of take this to really become that new world leader in this technology, and achieve some of these things that Trevor was just mentioning?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I know that the Forever Green team probably is closer to some of the farm economics. There is potential for additional net revenue for farmers, so that's one benefit. If you zoom out a little more to the SAF industry really writ large, I mean, we're looking at quite a bit of economic impact. Like these are just to get concrete, these are big facilities. They're kind of like ethanol plants. You know, the one that has been the most public about their intentions to locate in Minnesota is DG Fuels, which is in looking at a site in Moorhead, Minnesota, and that's a 5 billion plus plant. It's a very large one, so they're not all going to be that big. But you know, if we get to make the amount of SAF that would eventually supply the airport, that's tens of billions of dollars invested in kind of capital. Um, when we do economic analysis, and we're still kind of trying to refine and get deeper on this, it is again a nascent industry, and so some of the multipliers, we're trying to document our assumptions, but we're making some assumptions. But the even bigger economic benefits than the actual capital plant is the increased income and increased kind of jobs in the logistics, the feedstock, the moving it around, processing it, adding value here in Minnesota to it, and bringing it, all the way up to this really quite high value fuel. And so, I don't want to put numbers out there, but it's multiple times of that capital. And we are doing work on that and hope to have, better numbers by the end of the year, just to, have a better ballpark view of it. But it could be extremely helpful from an economic point of view. And most of the economics are going to be in, more rural parts of the state. Like the fuel will come into the airport, of course, but most of the construction and the jobs and the, kind of additional revenue would be in greater Minnesota.
That's great. And that wouldn't even be really the rural jobs you're talking about, a construction and things like that. That wouldn't even be the farmers on the ground planting the crops, right? That would be additional construction and things outside of that. That would be economic value. That's really exciting to hear.
Mhm.
Um, and then kind of, so I guess going back a little bit to how would this really help the farmers and their cash crops? Dr. Jordan, do you have I'm sure numbers on sort of like what would this really mean for the the farmers and the incentives that it could provide them?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me describe the benefits of growing these crops. And we can talk a little bit more broadly about incentives as well as time permits. But the most basic thing to know is that this 3 crops in 2 years concept does significantly increase the productivity of farms. So the total output of oil and protein from, say, growing both these winter hardy oil seeds and also the oil seed soybean is increased by 40% or so compared to only growing soybeans. So there's a very basic productivity aspect to this. There's also, we think, a profitability aspect. It's difficult to really nail that down, but I'll echo the conclusion that was arrived at in the report that Trevor has linked to in the chat. that there's the potential for 20% improvement in profit in growing these crops. So there are other important things that go into that, however. So one of the biggest problems that we have in the Midwest in terms of our basic production of our bread and butter crops is weed control. So we have a lot of problems with new kinds of weeds, weeds that are resistant to most of the herbicides that we have available to address weeds in that kind of farming. And so we have been able to document that adding these winter hardy oil seeds is able to suppress the growth of a lot of weeds in the early part of the growing season. And this has a very definite monetary value to farmers. There's also this business of taking good care of one's soil, and soil that has been protected from erosion and other damaging things like that is definitely more profitable. There's lots of research into the economic value of healthy soil for quite a few different reasons. And so the point that I want to make is that there are real benefits from diversifying our cropping production systems, and I've been ticking off a number of the significant ones. So there's, we think, a significant value that these crops offer to farmers um, who take up their production.
Great. So obviously these things sound, they're not without their challenges, but it's an exciting space, for sure. But I wonder, you've all mentioned some of the challenges, but Julia, are there some, as far as like being that this is a new industry, what are some of the challenges in launching that? How do we get this to the scale in which you have all been speaking of?
So there's a bunch of challenges. I think like almost every day I wake up and find out there's a new one. The So one of them is just technical. How there's sort of science and how do we do this? Every once in a while, um, I kind of step back and think about how what any kind of biofuel is doing is taking solar energy that plants converted into sugar, and then we're just rearranging all those sugar molecules, which are also hydrocarbons, and we're rearranging them in a way that it's octane or ethanol or whatever kind of hydrocarbon we want to burn. And that's pretty crazy that we can do that. So there's a technical piece in there about how do you take the whatever the plant material is and rearrange it. And how do you do that efficiently and cost effectively? And those are two very different things. So getting it to scale and having it, and then so there's scale, making a lot of it, making it cost effectively. And then jet fuel very sensibly has to meet quite strict uh, guidelines of what's in it. And so you have to fall in this criteria and get approval so that it can be flown in airplanes. And sorry, I have some notification setting going on. Um, uh, and I'm trying to turn off the uh, the so that's one piece. There's also, we're setting up a very different kind of um, again, supply chain. We in Minnesota have an ethanol industry where um, we know how to move feedstocks around and kind of turn that into biofuels, but we would be setting up supply chains in many different, for winter camelina, for instance, there's how you move the seeds around, there's how you get it to pre-processing facilities, there's you crush it into oil, there's moving the oil where it needs to be. So there's a lot of different steps within each of the feedstocks or each technology pathway um, that we have to build. So there's just a lot of innovation we're doing, and those are just a few of um, the sort of barriers we're anybody in the SAF field is trying to overcome. I think one last thing I will mention is that there is a challenge around um, carbon accounting that we are trying to figure out sort of some innovative way to address. There's um, uh, um, some thought that we have decent kind of or standardized, there's debate about it, but we in the United States have the GREET model that does life cycle carbon assessment. There's all sorts of other different systems based on GREET, and they don't always talk to each other. So how you account for that carbon throughout the value chain is really important. It's important in making sure that these fuels really are low carbon, and that is important in sort of public trust, and it's important in financing, right? Because banks don't want to finance things that aren't going to be profitable, and they aren't, if they know where the carbon is, it's easier to track the financial incentives. So that's another challenge that's a little in the weeds, but we are trying to think of ways to both build more transparent carbon accounting systems and potentially think about how you could have systems that account for, like a water quality benefit of a particular crop. Because right now, the GREET model that this is all built on is focused pretty much exclusively on carbon. So that's just like one click down on some of the stuff we're working on.
Sure. And we've heard many times the water
Yes.
benefit of all of this too shouldn't be
Yeah.
overlooked, definitely. So, and then maybe Trevor, you're the person to ask this question, but how do you see the role of the Minnesota House and Senate in creating a positive space for this sustainable aviation fuel transition? Like, what needs to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I see there's really two completely separate but related pathways for how that work can take place. The first is continuing to invest in the programs that make adoption of forever green cropping systems possible. And so there's three main pathways for that. The first is funding for University of Minnesota's Forever Green Initiative, developing the plant genetics necessary for these crops to improve and compete in the marketplace over time. Last year, we were able to secure funding from three different funding sources to help make that possible, about 8.3 million for the biennium from the legislature. And I want to say that everything that I'm about to describe has had bipartisan authors and strong bipartisan support in both the House and Senate, and strong leadership from the governor's office. So these aren't partisan issues. This is one of those rare areas where environmental sustainability and rural economic development and farm prosperity are all, so to speak, in the same language and working together. So there's funding for Forever Green itself. There's funding for farmer adoption, technical assistance, and de-risking through the ECO program, Environmental and Economic Clusters of Opportunity, which helps individual farm groups in specific geographic regions adopt these cropping systems and help bring them forward to market. And then there is a continuous living cover value chain grant program through the Minnesota Department of Agriculture that helps invest in the supply chain and market adoption systems necessary to really get these crops from the farm gate to the store shelf or the farm gate to the wing. So those are all areas where the state is helping provide that societal lift to forever green cropping systems. Secondly, there are specific tax and policy incentives related to sustainable aviation fuel. So whether that is providing a tax rebate on or exempting taxes for materials and used to build sustainable aviation fuel facilities, or doing what the state already has done, which is provide a Minnesota-based sustainable aviation fuel production tax credit that rewards the production of low-carbon fuels used for aviation that can be stacked with existing federal tax credits. And those two tax credits together can help make sustainable aviation fuel cost competitive and get into the wing more quickly and do more good for our environment and have that industry be based here in Minnesota. And here's why we think that's important. Aside from our existing biofuel infrastructure and a robust farm economy and great research institutions like University of Minnesota, and leadership from folks like the Minnesota SAF Hub and Delta Airlines and others that are investing in this space, it's that we also know that Minnesota has a strong water ethic, an environmental ethic, and social ethic. And so we feel like this is maybe the best place to do this work because we are capable of balancing the need for low cost, low carbon fuels while with maintaining water quality, rural economic fairness and environmental justice, soil health and pollinator habitat. And this seems to be one of the places where, and I believe our work last session speaks to this, environmental groups and industry groups and airlines and financiers and agricultural groups can all sit down at the table, work on legislation together, find consensus on areas of real import to our individual missions, and then move together in a cooperative fashion. And so I think that all of these different threads of work are really sort of weaving a web of success in Minnesota for what the SAF industry could look like in the future.
Great. Thank you for that. Um, I wanted to try to leave a few minutes for questions, but is there anything else that anybody would like to add, kind of wrapping up maybe even that conversation around kind of bringing all the different groups together? Like how are we successful in finding these solutions quickly? If there's anything else to add there, or if any of our panelists have anything else they'd like to say before we hop into a couple questions from the audience.
Well, I'll say just a bit about that, Liz. And the thing that I would like to highlight is that we know that innovations in agriculture and kind of anywhere else require some factors and inputs to make progress from being a good idea to having impact on the world. And what are those factors and inputs? So, on the one hand, we know that there has to be the basic science behind the innovation, but we also know that there must be markets that are interested in the innovation. We know that there must be availability of finance. We know that there must be favorable policy. And we also know that there needs to be cooperation among those different sectors of science and policy innovation and finance and risk management and private sector demand. And there needs to be a lot of learning. And these are all things that the Minnesota SAF Hub has very much stood up for the importance of. I think it's fair to say. Um, to integrate those different sectors and to help them learn from each other, learning important lessons like, guess what? Everyone's going to lose money in the early stages of trying to figure this out. Not just your sector, but everybody else. It's a lose, lose, lose proposition, as is typically true when innovations are going through the painful early phases of being refined. Um, and so these are all things that the SAF Hub, I think it's fair to say, is kind of standing up for, is this idea of learning and also the idea, which is, I think, generally understood to be crucial, of doing small scale experiments where you try to put the pieces together and see how the science, innovation, the policies, the financing, um, the market demand, they all fit together as a system because they have to be a system in which the parts work together. And the only way you actually find out if a system works is you try it out at a small scale. You expect to crash. And you have to do this, it's just your basic fail early and often concept of innovation. So we need that in this SAF space. And I think Minnesota is quite unique. And again, I am deeply appreciative of the initiative of the Minnesota SAF Hub in trying to create an environment where we can do this business of working out the bugs in so that we can realize the potential of SAF.
Great. Julia, do you want to also just take 1 second to
Yeah.
explain the the hub, since we didn't cover that
Sure.
too? There might be something, and but if you were going to say something else, start with that.
No, I was going to say just thank you to Dr. Jordan and thank you for to Trevor as well, I think we have really found a lot of value in the different relationships that we've built in the hub and the sort of like frank exchange of information. And this is something where the hub is not an organization. It's a place that is basically a group of companies or organizations, entities, other anybody uh, who are trying to make SAF real. And everybody has some self-interest in, self-interest, organizational priorities are being realized by the hub. And we're trying to make sure that we're always kind of boiling up the things that we're most aligned on and that are the best for the industry in the state. So it's really important to have lots of people at the table sharing what they know. And this is a fast moving field, and so we can't be everywhere at once. And we really benefit when more people are involved. But it's not an organization. It's pretty informal, and I am really working hard to get better communications set up so we have more of like a newsletter kind of thing going, and it's just easier to access information about what we're doing. You don't happen to be at the right webinar to learn about kind of what we're up to.
Maybe there's a space for us to help some of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, we
So
would love help with any kind of, especially email communication.
well, great. Thank you. I just want to remind participants if they have questions to go ahead and put those into the chat. We do have a couple coming in.
Mhm.
So let's get to those. Our first question comes from Steve. When will SAF be available to be used at the MSP airport at the small scale level? There was a lot of press last year about the first flight. Will there be more usage anytime soon?
Yeah, so I can take that. We had been targeting by the end of the year for first commercial or commercial scale ongoing use of SAF at the airport. The FAA requires that SAF be blended at a max 50/50 rate with conventional jet fuel, and you need a facility to do that. It's not a super complicated facility. I think it's like a really big Cuisinart, but the fuel that goes in and the fuel that comes out has to both meet spec for SAF. And uh, we are the Flint Hills is building one at the refinery that's connected by pipeline to the airport, and that is proceeding at pace. And they expect that that will be ready early 2026. Sorry. So soon, we hope. And it
That's
will be small scale, 5 million gallons a year kind of thing, but still a really good start.
Yeah, that's exciting. We will hope to see more news articles and things when that starts to happen
Mhm.
next year too as well. So then our next question, kind of changing directions here. Scott asks, I understand that Pennycrest and Camelina from an I understand Pennycrest and Camelina from an annual seed viewpoint related to getting out of the way for the summer crops. But what is the potential for perennial oil seeds like Silphium? And is there um and is there a way to do kind of two crops that way to have the greater appeal? And if then second part of that, if camelina becomes a cash crop, will the USDA classify that as a cover crop? So
Well, thank you, Scott, for your obviously sophisticated perspective and also for like knowing about silphium. So let me speak to the first matter. So silphium is an example of a perennial oilseed crop. So winter camelina and pennycress are annual oilseed crops. And there are lots and lots of benefits to perennial crops in terms of their ability to build soil and a bunch of other benefits, both to farmers and to the environment in general. However, perennial crop development is very much it's a challenging thing to do simply because perennial crops are generally speaking not built to be hugely productive of seeds because they put a lot of their energy into hanging around in the soil, not being eaten by herbivores, things like that. So we are making progress on developing silphium. We've made a ton of progress considering the relatively few years that people have been trying to breed silphium as a perennial oilseed crop. By the way, it's a native prairie plant that many people might know as cup plant, is a kind of silphium. And so it's coming along. It's not going to be ready for prime time for some years. The Scott also mentioned the question about can will we be able to get some of the benefits in terms of cost share and other kinds of subsidies that are offered to farmers for growing cover crops if we actually harvest commodities from the cover crops. And technically speaking, it ain't a cover crop if you harvest something that in the way of a commodity that you can sell. And so there is some work to be done. Scott, we're not there yet. And this is an example of how it's really important to be working on the policy angle while you are also trying to work on the crop angle and trying to work to build markets. It's all a system, it's all one big puzzle that has to be fit together.
And Nick, I might just chime in and that many farm operations need to take out crop insurance to manage risk, and about 60% of those premiums are paid for by the public. It's about $8 billion a year that makes these systems possible. Most of those risk mitigation tools are built for corn, soybean, other commodity crops, and they're really not built for winter annual oilseeds or other new and innovative crops. And so a number of organizations, including some of the folks on this call, as well as the National Sustainable Ag Coalition and many other ag sustainability and climate groups around the country, are working with Congress to see if we can get changes to programs like the Whole Farm Revenue Protection Program or other crop insurance programs in place so that farmers can appropriately de-risk and share the risk a little bit publicly of trying these new innovative crops without literally having to bet the farm.
Thank you for that. Um, we have another question from Jessica. I think folks are really interested in how these crops really work in the ground, and how it works for farmers. So, Jessica asks, can you speak to the impact of the three crop approach on the soil health? Do the rotating crops delete or replenish the soil?
Mm, thanks for that question. Well, even though these crops are technically not cover crops because of how the USDA defines them, they certainly function like cover crops. In other words, so critically, they cover up the soil and have marked effects on reducing the loss of soil to erosion. And they also support that great diversity of living things that is important to maintaining the health and the quality of soil. So certainly these crops qualify as people often use the term regenerative crops to describe crops that are building soil and also helping to regenerate other things like wildlife that are beneficial insects and such as pollinators that are really crucial resources in science and in farming rather. So yes, these are certainly regenerative crops because of their basic qualities, even if you can argue whether they're technically cover crops or not.
Great. And then we have Marsha has a question about who else is working on this, and if there's, we all have family in Wisconsin. She has a brother-in-law in Wisconsin that's a farmer. Um, so is the University of Wisconsin involved in this? Are we just, exceptional here in Minnesota in our programs, or kind of what's the extent nationally or more broadly to this program?
Yeah. I would say anything from Minnesota has certain intrinsic advantages over products of other states nearby. But it is, in fact, the case that there's a whole national effort to develop these crops. So the term that we should be using here is an intermediate energy crop, Marcia. And so what that means is a crop that's grown between other crops, that's the intermediate part, and that produces some kind of bioenergy. And there are roughly five such crops that are pretty well developed, including pennycress and winter camelina, but including others that grow in other parts of the country. And so if you think about the total effort on all those crops, which are all relevant to SAF, it's a significant national effort. It's um, it's specifically true that that pennycress is being developed by researchers at a number of universities in the more southern parts of the U.S. That's because the southern part of the Midwest, not the U.S. So Illinois and places like that. And this is because pennycress does better a little further south than this crop winter camelina. So yes, it is a broad effort, and our colleagues in Wisconsin are certainly involved too.
Great. Well, we're just about out of time. Is there anything that any of our panelists would like to add as closing remarks here before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'll offer maybe just a reminder, something that we keep in the back of our minds when we're doing this work is that low carbon is not necessarily synonymous with sustainable. And so we've got lots of different options for feedstocks from biofuels, from forest products, from green hydrogen, from a variety of other sources, waste, animal manure, et cetera, that all have, different carbon life cycle greenhouse gas emissions reductions benefits. And we can quantify those quite well. Are not all co-equal in terms of their net sustainability benefits, while also, embracing water quality and soil health and continuous living cover, providing pollinator habitat in a landscape that's otherwise pretty brown and barren in March and April each year, providing access to farmers to use their fields more efficiently and bring in more income from the same landscape, so that we are not, incentivizing direct or indirect land use change in other parts of the country or in other parts of the world. And so it's important for us to keep in mind that there is a sphere of sustainability around all of these crops, and low carbon is one component of it. But it's important that we all work together to know, identify, discuss, and optimize the full sustainability portfolio of the SAF we bring to market.
Thanks for that, Trevor. Anything else to add or?
I'm just seeing a lot of good questions in the chat that I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get to. So if anyone, my email is on, yes, you have a very chocolatey tongue. Oh, is that blood? Oh, I, my email is on the SAF Hub website, and I'd be delighted to talk with anybody about productivity per gallon and anything else related to SAF, but I'm going to go help this guy. Sorry.
Well, with that, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you to our panelists, Dr. Nick Jordan, Trevor Russell, and Julia Silvis for sharing your expertise with us, taking time out of your evening, away from families, all the things. And every Minnesotan deserves clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. And Conservation Minnesota will continue to advocate for the sustainable aviation fuels and to improve our water quality, decrease emissions. Um, Please visit our website, conservationminnesota.org, to stay informed about this issue and other conservation issues. And if you are interested in watching previous Tell Me More webinars, you can visit our YouTube channel, Conservation Minnesota, and we will make available the contact information for hosts too. If there are other questions that did not get answered tonight, we appreciate everybody's time. So thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye bye.
Thanks, Liz.